Our first speaker at this year's event is Richard Slaughter, Director of Foresight International. Richard is one of the leading sort of futurists, perhaps internationally, and also has been involved in many countries around the world, and is the author of some 20 books, highly regarded in their specialised area of foresight and looking at where the whole world is going. So, could you please welcome Richard Slaughter?
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. Phil, we've had a day's seminar already with all that material. I think your brains must be going around in circles, mine is. I was also delighted to see one of my previous students' names up there too, which does show that doing foresight work can lead to real jobs and places in the real world, which is wonderful. I wanted to begin by just looking back there here at Councillor Stephen Main's comment that the challenge facing all elected officials is the need to take a longer-term view beyond the current electoral cycle. And given the intensity of all the work, the problems, the transformative things that are happening, that's obviously not going to be easy to do. So I want to try and draw out a possible response to that. I also want to say that there are 2 or 3 key ideas behind what I want to do, and I think some of them have already been touched on already. One is that giving away any notion that the present that we live in is in any sense normal in terms of any historical precedent. There are lots and lots of things about the world we live in that are utterly new, utterly distinctive, and that require really high-level attention. The second that really follows from that is that the near-term future is incredibly unstable, therefore entirely unpredictable. So we can't look ahead and look at these smooth trends that were used in shell scenarios and back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and say we can get a grip on this, see where things are going and make the right decisions. It's more of a continuous monitoring of the things that you think are important, and that's different for everybody, every different organization. So the takeaway message from that is the need to create the appropriate organizational capabilities, and I think that's hopefully where I can add something of value to this meeting. So why the biggest wake-up call in history? Well, basically what I do is I look at signals of change. I probably spend half an hour most days culling what we call scanning hits from all sorts of sources. And the best ones I collect and I file in about 25 folders. So, and I must say, I must make this really clear, one of those folders says good news. Because there's so much challenge and change and crisis around, I think it's really important to hold on to some of the good things that are happening to have a clear view of what some of those are. However, I really wanted to look for myself and decide, what really is going on out there in the big picture? And does it make sense to think of it in terms of a crisis, a collapse, a breakdown, a transformation? What is actually going on? So I wrote a book called The Biggest Wake-Up Call in History, in which I looked at the evidence, and then I looked at some of the ways people had started to respond to that evidence. So what I'm trying to do here today, very briefly, and I'll try and speak more slowly. I may run out of time. If I do, then you'll have the backup of the PowerPoint later. I'm not going to rush through this, so I'm not going to speak to every point. But I guess what I want to do is to take us out of the local and the immediate to start with, and just think about some of the things we've learned over the last decade or so about the global context. The wake-up call really is about paying attention to that primary context. And out of that, I think, comes a way of thinking about that which moves us away from the kind of catastrophic stuff that we get emphasized really too often. And it led me to a concept of descent, D-E-S-C, futures, out of which I think can come some very interesting work. So what is the evidence for a wake-up call, responses, methods? I particularly want to stress reframing optimism and pessimism. There's a sadly very persistent idea that optimism is good and pessimism is bad, whereas most of us realize that those kind of polarities are just that. And in fact, it's possible to be optimistic and do nothing, and pessimistic and really burr in the saddle. You've got to deal with this. So the point is that both optimism and pessimism are ambiguous, and what matters is how we use both of them in all sorts of situations. So the fact that we may well be, in my opinion, we are facing an incredibly unstable, incredibly challenging future does not automatically translate into, oh my God, this is awful. What matters is how we respond. So 2 books. I'm not here to sell books. We have a few at home, but we've made them available as PDFs and EPUBs from the Foresight International site. We're basically winding down, so we're not out here to sell them, but if anyone's interested, we can find you copies. One of the things I did in Biggest Wake Up Call was look at what do we actually know about the global system. Now, I understand that no one's got time to read all this stuff unless, like myself, you've been a dedicated Foresight person for ages and you happen to have tracked through that. But when you start putting this body of knowledge together, I submit to you that it's pretty impressive. It's nobody's fantasy. I don't really take from any single source an authoritative view. I always compare sources, maybe 3, 4, I don't know how many, depends on the situation. And I try to triangulate what sense can I make out of these different sources. So the view I have after 40 years in futures is not really mine. It's a synthesis of the very best work that I've been able to find around the world. A few things stand out. I first heard Will Stephan speak at an Ideas Festival in Brisbane some years ago, and I was really impressed at his modesty, his clarity. He really understood what he was talking about, and I did go away and get a copy of this book, Global Change in the Earth System. Now, I have to tell you, it was a damned heavy read. It's not something I could get through quickly. I divided it up, I read a chapter at a time, tried to get inside it and understand it, and I still couldn't deal with all the detail because there were masses of scientific studies quoted. And if this is a book with all the solid, heavy, if there was a book with all the solid, heavy evidence, this was it. But here's the conclusions. The impact of human activities on the global atmosphere is unmistakable and profound. They're driving the Earth system well outside its normal operating range, and our relationship with that system is seeing the most rapid transformation ever. So that's partly what's behind my comment about the distinctiveness of the present, is that the relationship of our species with the rest has transformed during that time. But the way we work, we tend to go for the safe, the familiar, and we tend to this all tends to drift out of sight because it is out of sight. People who have looked at this, there are quite a few of them, really have come to a view that humanity overshot certain global limits somewhere in the 80s. There's a lot of debate about exactly when, but there is a coalescence of informed views that something like this happened at that point. A lot of different studies. This one was carried out in 2009 and published in Nature, which is one of the most conservative natural science journals. And back then in 2009, there were already several key parameters of the global system that had been exceeded. A few more were expected. And yet it was really interesting. When that was reported in New Scientist, I found the conclusion to the article really quite weird because it was all about a safe space for humanity. That was the theme of the article, the title that the editors gave it. And yet what the article was actually saying was that the safe space for humanity had actually diminished. So something interesting going on there. I'm not going to lecture you about peak oil and climate change. You know all about that. But I have to say that our ability to handle this has been hugely complicated by all kinds of factors, particularly in the social and economic area. And yet, if you put this on a long scale, as Heinberg did in Power Down, you can see that this pyramid, this narrow pyramid, is a very small blip on the historical scale. So a massive amount of change, again, packed into a tiny period of oil being exploited, oil running out, and us having to do something about it. There are generic ways of responding to this. And this was first mooted in the Meadows. I'll come back to the Meadows work some years ago. Ways of responding to these difficult issues. They said that the first response was to basically deny, disguise, or confuse the signals, which they said was close to universal. I don't think that's true now. They said that another response was to alleviate the pressures through technological fixes, which I think was and is common. And then lastly, to work on the underlying causes and change the structure of the system. Well, I think that with the emergence of systems thinking over the last 30, 40 years, that's become a lot more feasible. So what was really quite far out then is now a lot more doable. But it was interesting, a colleague of mine from Japan found this illustration for me of tsunami marker stones in Japan, where an experience of a tsunami at a certain time had led them to record the event, but that didn't actually stop them from having large areas of lowlands developed and become vulnerable to more recent ones. So even if you know about something, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that you're going to do the right thing to protect downstream people. So there's a few major things that I think affect all this, and one I want to touch on, come back, is something that I've worked on with a young colleague, and we published this in the last issue of last year, a journal called Foresight, volume 16, number 6, 2014, and the issue was called Descent Pathways. It was about looking for ways off of this impossible pinnacle into a more stable kind of environment. And the editorial dealt with this issue of the scale of the three economies, the Earth economy, or the primary economy, the secondary human physical economy, and the tertiary service and financial economy. Now, I'm not going to go into that now. I'm not ready to do it. It's not the right time. But if you are interested in reading that editorial, I did put it on my weblog. If you richardslaughter.com.au, look under Action Resources or under Publications, you can find that editorial. It's about 8 pages long. And it gives an overview that reminds us that the culture we live in tends to privilege that second layer. That is, when we think about finances and decisions and organizations, we almost always begin and end somewhere in that middle layer, maybe going into the third layer of finances. That's come onto the agenda a lot lately. And the primary Earth economy just tends to drift out of sight. So we need to remember to bring that primary issue of what everything's actually standing on in the first place back into clear focus. There are a range of macro issues that emerge from that. One of the biggest is the issue of growth. On one hand, in a common sense way, you and I all know that growth in a finite system can't go on forever. It's obvious. But again, the culture we live in, there's so much happening within the culture that is invisible. It's invisible because we're so used to it that we don't give it a lot of thought. But one of those things is the assumption that growth is good, and it has been. And we need to really start getting to grips with some of the implications of it. How to adapt an economic system that's predicated on growth, that has a long history of it, into a different era. The whole question of money, I could spend a whole seminar, if I knew enough, really on trying to get into what money is and what's happening to money. the dematerialization of money has opened up all sorts of opportunities and also downsides of those. I'll give you one quick example. I'm sure you've all heard of Bitcoin. It's seen by some people as a really innovative thing. It's got a blockchain that records all the transactions, and it's in use in all sorts of places. I saw the other day a signal, a hit, which mentioned that people who were hit with a certain virus were directed to pay to have their systems opened up again by buying and sending bitcoins to the criminals who had shut their system down. So here on the one hand, this is technology for you. A lot of brilliant stuff on the upside, a lot of hidden costs on the downside. Is Bitcoin any good? I don't know. It'll be a social experience to find out whether it's useful or not. So we've heard a lot today about the internet, and personally I think that's one of the areas where we need to tread much more carefully. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail. I'll leave this for you to read on the later on, because we haven't got a huge amount of time. But it's important to get inside growth and what it means and why it's so dominant and why we found it so convenient, while at the same time engaging with the whole issue of the limits to growth and what that means. Certain delay here. Yeah. I'm going to say a little bit more about this. The digital revolution is a bit like the Industrial Revolution. Winners, losers. It'll take a long time for us to really adapt to the digital revolution and use it well. The disruptions are already happening. If you're a content creator, a writer, an artist, or a middle person in a transactional chain, you're likely to be out of work, or you'll see your pay go down. Certain professions are dying, just like the Industrial Revolution, and a plethora of new ones is opening up. I maintain that the digital revolution is fundamentally ambiguous in that it gives us things that are useful on the one hand, but at the same time it exerts a kind of backward adaptation on us all. And I'm actually getting a bit tired of having my phone nudging me to tell me to do things or to learn about this or to talk to Siri or something. And I think it should just be there. It should just be a damn phone. I don't want it to be a multimedia monster sitting in my pocket. I'm actually thinking of getting a simpler phone because I'm a bit tired of it. Something that doesn't always get mentioned is the influence of what have become known as the internet oligarchs. These are the Googles, the Apples, and the Facebooks of the world. But over the last year, I've done a fair amount of work on this myself. And I would say to you, we have a serious problem here. Now, that first video that John put up was actually really useful, because what it gave you was the shiny, bright, upside version of a communication company's view of the future. That's what it wants you to believe. But the downside of that is probably the polar opposite of everything that said. If you read this book, Big Data, you would think that having all this information at your fingertips was the best thing since sliced bread. And there's a sense in which that's true. If you want to optimize the functioning of complex systems, such as traffic lights in the city or a million other things, garbage collection, it works. It's been proven. Absolutely brilliant mechanism for control. But there's one person, this is unusual, there's one individual in this world that I found so far who sees through this more clearly than anyone else, and his name is Morozov. And his second book is called To Save Everything, Click Here. The first one's called The Net Delusion. And I would suggest to you that chap's work is definitely worth a look. If you haven't got time to read it, which I get, you can always find reviews of these works by him. And in half an hour, you can get across the essence of what this guy's saying. That's a useful use of the technology. What Morozov is saying is that the internet revolution has been drastically oversold and that the downside is indeed savage. So if you start to look at that, my first awareness of this came with a book by a guy called Misha Glenny, and he wrote a book called Mafia, where he looked at criminal networks and how they were organizing in the world. And this is probably 8 years ago. And I began to see how being able to make transactions anonymously had been a tremendous help to organized crime around the world. Now that developed. Other work shows how in Ukraine, pre-crisis, some very bright Russian guys got together and developed the card scamming devices. And so this whole hidden industry has grown just out of sight to the point now which I think is entirely unacceptable, that someone who maybe isn't too au fait with the technology, not too aware of the dangers, innocently clicks on a link, it's curtains. I think that's wrong. So what I'm saying is it will take time to find out, to tease out what is good and useful about the internet from what is dangerous and what needs to be just really kept in place. And one of those things is the Internet of Things. We're being told, we're not asked, that this is the next big thing. Is it the next big thing? Because what seems to me is that we've got a system of connecting up the world, but we haven't got a system of protecting it. So in a sense, the vision of the internet oligarchs is to sell more of this stuff to us, to get us more adapted, to use it, and we can, but we should do it in a way that's really critical and aware of the costs and the downside, because they're certainly there. Another critical concept to bear in mind is one that came up a few years ago, the notion that we've entered a whole new era of human-initiated changes, dubbed the Anthropocene. That really helps to locate ourselves as central actors on the whole global scene. Won't go into it in detail, but it's worth following out if you're interested. I want to mention very briefly a project that some of you may have heard of, I'm not sure, but it began in about 1972, a report to the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. Now, what happened at the time is that the conclusions of this study were so unacceptable to the majority, particularly to corporations, that a tremendous effort was mounted to destroy it, basically. And it was really pilloried, put aside, and forgotten. But what actually happened was that the study continued for another 30 years and produced some amazingly good material. The study was saying, look, these processes are occurring, we don't understand them fully, but in our present understanding, it seems to us that if certain things continue like this, then we'll have these sorts of problems will emerge. It came and went. More recently, in about the last 4 or 5 years, a few very, very good people have looked back at that project and reevaluated. What was it about? How good was it? Graham Turner in CSIRO is one of the people who did that, and he wrote some excellent paper. And one of them showed that the standard run of the scenarios that the Limits to Growth team developed had basically mirrored what happened in the real world later on. In other words, it was much closer to reality, to being credible, than it was given any credit for at the time. A brand new book by Kerryn Higgs, she's an academic from Tasmania called Collision Course, puts this into the Australian context. I recommend this book most highly to anyone who is interested in teasing out what's useful about growth, what's useful about critiques of growth, what difference does this make? So here we have an example of a piece of work that had a lot to offer, but was sidelined because it was actually happening and emerging around the same time that economic rationalism got started, the Thatcher-Reagan axis, and that whole view of reality that became so powerful. And they didn't want to know about it. One of the very good points I think Karen Higgs makes is that we are now dealing with more extreme versions of the very issues they described. So what's the point of putting time and effort into foresight? It's not that you can predict the future. It means you can navigate complexity with a surer foot, to be metaphorical about it. So this is one of the reasons that my colleague and I really started looking at this issue of we don't wish to believe that civilizational collapse is around the corner. Yes, there's plenty of evidence for it, but that's just words. What's really happening here? How do we think about it? How can our cultures grasp the specialness of our time and navigate more confidently? So we looked at the contrast between collapse, which is a pretty negative thing, to the notion of descent. And there's a great deal in that, which I think is really handy and really useful. I put some of the references there. David Holmgren is a co-initiator of permaculture in Australia, and his version of this is to look at scenarios that run global warming, benign and destructive against slow and fast oil decline. One person's effort, very worthy to be taken in context with others. So it seems to me that it's really useful to revise notions of growth, to really try and get inside what's happening there, to look at these meta goals of equity and sustainability, and to balance technical with human and cultural development. We hear a great deal about rampaging technology, but we kind of forget that it's an American habit that we've all inherited to some extent, and I'm not being disrespectful of my American colleagues and friends, to say that they tend to make technology the most powerful actor, whereas any technology we see is in fact just the outgrowth of a set of social and cultural and technical processes. A technology is actually something that's like a long fan of activity that emerges with these bits and pieces of stuff. So it's not just about the stuff. It's about the way that stuff gets promoted and sold and marketed and used and promoted to us as if it's the answer. Technology is in the future, but I like to think that the answer is a mixture of thinking, human factors, cultural factors. I don't have time to go into this. So here's one of the tasks I think we can undertake. To realize that we're misdirected a lot of the time by the way the media work, and particularly by the incredible incursion of commercial imperatives into that media. Another task is to really understand what's at stake. And Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, whether you are in her kind of world or not, is definitely worth taking seriously, having a look at. I think I mentioned this before, so I'm not going to repeat it now, but optimism and pessimism. The fact that we are all being pushed out of comfort zones, and that's just the way it is. But does that lead us to stress and crisis and despair, or does it lead us to think about expanding human capacity? Human capacity is not something that's set and settled. It grows, it develops, it changes, it can be augmented in so many different ways. I found the work of Ken Wilber very interesting here because on the other side to all the stuff about technology, there's a lot of good material about how values help to drive things, how worldviews assemble those values, and how a conventional worldview makes you want to just go with the way things are, whereas a post-conventional one opens up new possibilities. And I think that's where we need to be, to move from the conventional, accepting the way things are, thinking, to really seeing things as much more open and changeable. That's the context in which I'm most comfortable with the word innovation. Don't have much time to talk about the 4 domains. 4 windows looking at the world, 2 of them interior, human and cultural interiors, 2 of them exterior. We tend to focus very much on the lower right. That's the collective exterior, the stuff, as I said before. One little book that puts a lot of this into a ridiculously small package is Zia Sardar's book, Future. He's the former editor of Futures. He knows of which he writes. It's less than $20. It's on some bookshelves now. I reviewed it. I think it just gives you, in a nutshell, busy people can't read big tomes, but this little book just gives you the essence of what Futures is all about. And I think the thing that's missing, the thing I want to really put on the table for you to consider as the conference goes on, is this question of organizational capability. You can't expect busy people to do more, but if you're changing the structures, I would argue very strongly that it's worth thinking about what sort of high-quality foresight capability can be built into that reassembly of structures and shared across the domain. Because that's where I think the biggest payoff lies. I will say that there is a new generation of young scholars and practitioners in Australia who are out there and who've the sort of people who can do this. One of them was mentioned in passing earlier. The example I would give you, that's an American example, the Institute for the Future. It's based in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. And so, of course, a lot of its work is connected with what the Apples and Googles do. But they've been going for some time. That's one model of how to do it. It's a private organization, and they do very well. But the one I think that might be more relevant here is the program up in Singapore, the Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning Unit. And interestingly, it's actually located in or next to the Prime Minister's office. So you can see they've given it a really high priority in that environment. And I think the reason they did that is quite simply because they have no resources. They have to live by their wits. They have their people, biggest resource, but they have to be smart, forward-thinking. They have to understand change. Whereas we in Australia, we have all this stuff that people dig up. We kind of feel we don't need it. But I would suggest to you that we need this kind of high-quality capability every bit as much as the Singaporeans do. So if you're any doubt about it, have someone take a look at it, assess how good it is. It's not the only example. It's just one that I happen to pick on to make this more concrete. This is their one of their 3 units. They use the data, they model systems, they share perspectives, and they integrate this with the other work of the organization. There is professional support around. The APF is the Association of Professional Futurists. It is based in the US, but it's truly international. The UTS has the Institute for Alternative Futures. UQ has, in the last couple of years, created the Global Change Institute, which is an extremely high-end entity in a beautiful new building. And Swinburne still has the Masters of Strategic Foresight that I was associated with some years ago. So there are places to go to find the people to help with this kind of work. So my question to you really as a group is, do you have access to this kind of high-quality foresight? If not, why not? In the country as a whole, we don't have the infrastructure. We've had the beginnings of it, and then personally, my view is that the very strong headwinds created by a certain view of the world and a certain view of economics and society made their existence very difficult. And that's the underlying reason why the Commission for the Future failed instead of evolving into something more powerful. I would suggest looking at examples overseas. and to think seriously about all the other things you have to do, but how can we participate in or help to create a Foresight culture? There's a lot of very interesting material there. The transition towns have been going for a long time. I'm beginning to see transition cities that are really picking up on what needs to be done, not just building more modern stuff, but investing in the systems that have to do with air, water, food, and so forth. I think there's a lot of mileage in that, and it obviously would be a community thing as well. So the whole pile of transformative options, I think I'm running out of time, so I haven't got time to go through them, but I will come to the conclusion, which is really where I started. We underestimate the power of change, prefer to stay with the known. I think I've added to the view put earlier that the near-term future is unstable. I've also said it's unpredictable, means finding ways to pay attention that are useful to an organization. I do believe we can deal with this emergent, complex, and very challenging future, but only if we pay attention in the right ways and create the organizational capacity to do so. The human capacity, as I said, has already been augmented in this country. We just don't have the organizational framework. Business as usual, I think this was another point that came earlier. It is not credible. There is no business as usual. Or you may prefer this. Is there time for a question?
Questions for Richard Slaughter?
Can we have a break?
Thank you for the presentation. There seem to be two very broad responses to things like the video that John showed earlier on. One is that that's a wonderful future, and there are people like me who think that's an absolutely horrible future of having our lives absolutely controlled by technology and everybody and Big Brother knowing what we're doing. One response could possibly be that people will reject, or there will be sections of the community that reject that sort of future and go off and create something different. How do you think those people could be involved in the future, involved in democracy? Will that sort of future disenfranchise those people, and how can we stop that from happening?
Well, to take the last bit first, I think it disenfranchises everyone. There's a fair amount of credibility to the view that Robert Owen's idea in Victorian era of a panopticon, of a prison surrounded by mirrors where no one could move without being monitored, is actually being assembled around us. That's all about the privacy debate and the loss of privacy. So I think everyone suffers under that. There's an excellent book. I picked up a copy in Germany last year while we were traveling called The Circle by a guy called Dave Eggers. It's not exactly an attractive title, but it's a fascinating study of walking into that future bit by bit by bit as the panopticon becomes more compelling, more universal. And it really is a straight walk to dystopia. So there's no doubt in my mind that nobody wins under that scenario except the internet oligarchs who temporarily become very rich, and then the whole thing becomes unstable. So I think that the answer to that, the first part of your question has already been answered in terms of the tremendously intense community participation, consultation. In many places, there are people who run community futures workshops, looking at people's own visions for the future, the very issues that you mentioned that concern them and how they can be resolved. So there are lots of practical ways of dealing with that. As you've got to have the trained people to do it well, though. I mean, in the past, there's been a certain amount of futures work done which is just naive and not dealing with the realities of our actual world. So I think you do need to draw into to play that younger generation of practitioners that I mentioned and put them out into community settings where this work can indeed be done.
Hello, thanks Richard. My name's Paul Bishop. I'm a city councillor in Redland City up in Brisbane, and I'm also a citizen journalist and very interested in exactly the framing that you've put, because I think it's impossible for us to consider the future without looking at some of the bigger geopolitical zeitgeists that are going on.
Yep.
One of the things that I was interested in is, what are your examples of things that are working? This morning I went for a walk and I saw Food Bank, who are taking food from a number of inputs from local farmers, but also from multinationals, and creating feedback loops back to the whole of those who are on the other side of food sovereignty or food sustainability.
Yeah.
I think that, what are the sorts of ways that you're seeing examples of people working best in this new collaborative space, aware of the challenges, but working positively and proactively?
Well, one of the obvious ones would be crowdfunding, where you've got a project that you think makes an awful lot of sense, but there's no one around, there are no angel investors in sight. So you start activating your networks, and put the idea out there. And it's amazing how many things have been actually achieved by just using the networks creatively and responsibly. What I haven't said is how we are still very naive in the way that we put our whole lives on social media. And I think there's a bit of a backlash beginning to occur there, because putting that information out there, if you say you're having a great holiday, this is where you are, but it also says where you're not. And there have been some examples of that being taken advantage of. So I think we're just going to have to be a lot more careful about what we allow out. There are lots more examples I could give you. You may not agree with them, but the Get Up organisation, I'm not saying I approve it, I'm not a member, but that's another way of mobilising large numbers of people for particular causes. The Rally for the Reef, two of those are taking place in Brisbane. So community engagement, activation, there's all sorts of fundraising things that was mentioned in one of those promos that can be achieved, but always with a sense of enormous care that these are incredibly powerful tools. They have to be used very, very carefully. And for God's sake, don't believe what Apple, Google, and Facebook tell you, because it's not true.
Okay, can we please thank Richard Slaughter? Okay, the second presentation this morning is from